Magnus Carlsen has stormed back in the Superbet Rapid and Blitz tournament. In the Rapid portion, the first half of the tournament, he did not play well. In the Blitz portion, he absolutely dominated, and there are many interesting games to select from. I've chosen this miniature against Richard Rapport, full of very interesting tactics. Rapport has white, Carlsen has black. Let's jump right in. D4, knight f6. And Rapport, known for his unusual openings, although this is not that unusual, plays a Trompovsky. The idea is to create maybe some pawn damage against black, and also to advance the e-pawn to e4 very quickly, and white's willing to give up the bishop pair for this. Carlsen plays e6, and this eliminates the prospects of any pawn structure damage. It's a safe approach, really, to the Trompovsky. The most common move here is e4. After h6, bishop takes knight, queen takes. You have black's two bishops competing against white's space and easier development. But in this case, Rapport plays knight to d2 first, then h6, bishop h4, and now c5. Magnus attacks the center from the side, and in that way hopes to get an extra central pawn himself. Rapport plays e3, pawn takes, and Magnus does get an extra pawn in the center, 2 versus 1. And this is actually a Carlsbad structure. You would get the same pawn structure in a Caro-Kann exchange variation, for example. Bishop to e7, c3, and b6. Magnus is looking to develop this bishop on c8, either to b7 or a6, and he wants to wait before he commits the pawn from d7 to d5. If he did that, he might end up blocking that bishop in. He doesn't have to do it yet, so he delays that move. Bishop to d3, and bishop to a6. Carlsen says, I'm going to try to exchange off white's good bishop for my bad bishop, and then create a light-squared pawn structure. Queen to f3 counterattacks Magnus Carlsen's rook at a8. Now d5 is played to block that attack, and bishop to c2. So Rapport says, I'm going to keep that bishop, but he does have to concede the a6 f1 diagonal, which is a very effective diagonal for that bishop, and makes it a little harder for him to castle kingside because you can't castle over check. Knight to c6, and knight to e2 is played here, and this is a novelty. In the one previous game that reached this position, they took on f6. Knight to e2, and one thing that does do is allow white to castle short if he would like to. But Magnus plays knight to e4, causing a bit of a crisis, and this begins a fairly long string of really interesting and complex tactics. Obviously, if white takes on e4, then black would just take on h4, and he'd have the two bishops without much to suffer. He would just be in a good position here. So instead of doing that, Rapport plays bishop takes e7. And here, if queen e7, that would actually be a blunder for Magnus, because knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and with this pin on the c6 knight, white is completely and totally winning in that position. So instead, Magnus interposes by taking the knight on d2. Now, both queens are under threat at the moment. So this begins really a long string of tactics. Now here, if bishop takes d8, the knight f3 check, gf3, and white's structure is permanently damaged on the king side. The best idea for white is probably king takes d2, queen e7, and computers like this, but human beings tend not to like their king being in the middle of the board. But this was, from a theoretical standpoint, probably the best. But Rapport begins a series of desperado moves where each side is constantly attacking and not backing down. He begins with this move, queen takes f7 check. Now, he's not just giving up his queen because he's attacking Magnus's queen, and after king takes queen, he retakes the queen on d8. Now here, if knight takes d2, king takes d2, Rapport would just be up a healthy pawn, so Magnus has to find another way to generate complications here, and he comes up with the move knight to c4. The bishop on d8 is hanging, but the knight is attacking the b2 pawn. The bishop moves from the threat, and knight takes b2, and that creates a balance of material. They both have the same material right now. And Rapport's best move, probably, again, rook to b1. And after knight c4, bishop to d3, you have a playable game, basically. But he plays h4, much more ambitious, threatening h5 and clamping down on these kingside light squares along with the bishop on c2, controlling g6. But that's a little, he doesn't really have time for that. And after rook a to c8, a strong move, attacking the bishop and by x-ray pressure the pawn on c3, Magnus is in really good shape. If he plays bishop g3, then bishop takes e2, king e2, and then this shot, knight takes d4 check, taking advantage of the fact that there is a pin on the c-file, and Magnus would be winning. So instead, he plays rook to b1, counterattacking the knight on b2. With rook c7, rook b2, rook h8, black is in good shape here as well. But in the game, he plays the move knight to c4, and this has a pretty nasty threat associated with it, but there's not really much white can do to stop it, because Rapport's bishop on c7 is still under attack from the rook, so he has to do something about that. He retreats it to f4, but now the sort of the tail end of all of these tactics, Magnus plays knight to a3, hitting the rook and the bishop. I mean, he can't give up his rook, it would be too much material. So he moves the rook to b2 to defend that bishop. Magnus takes the bishop, rook takes the bishop, and believe it or not, the next move of this game is the last move of this game. Magnus plays, and this is move 20, knight to b4. And that's it. The game is essentially over, and here's why. The rook is under attack. There's obviously a pin down the c-file, so you can't take the knight. The rook moves to c1, knight to d3 check, forks the king and rook. If the rook moves to b2, knight to d3 check also forks the king and the rook. Rook's just on a different square. So what about rook to d2? That avoids the fork and helps to cover d3 a little bit, but then knight to d3 check. It's the king hits the bishop. If the king moves to d1, then knight to f2 check, forks the king and the other rook. And then, most attractive, after king to f1, knight takes bishop, and the knight cannot be recaptured because the knight at e2 is pinned by this quite powerful now bishop on a6. One of many great games I could have selected, but Magnus was really on fire today. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.